He kept the gloves. He kept the forceps. He kept a tag that once read, John Doe. For 33 years, a man who had touched the body of the most famous entertainer in American history said almost nothing about what happened inside that preparation room. Then, in the summer of 2010, he tried to sell it all, and in doing so, he reopened one of the strangest chapters in the story of Elvis Presley's death. What did he see that night? Why did he hold on to those tools for over 3 decades instead of throwing them away like any other embalming case? And why, when he finally spoke, did he only give the public a single unfinished sentence? Stick with us, because the story behind this collection is stranger, sadder, and more revealing than most fans realize. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was 42 years old and, by most accounts from the people around him, in good spirits. He had spent the previous evening at Graceland doing ordinary things, playing racquetball with his cousin Billy Smith, sitting at the piano to sing gospel songs, talking about an upcoming tour he seemed genuinely excited to start. Nothing about that night suggested anyone was watching the final hours of a legend. Later, Elvis went upstairs, and at some point took a book into his bathroom, something he often did. Hours went by. Eventually his fiancée, Ginger Alden, went to check on him and found him collapsed on the floor, unresponsive. Paramedics were called, and by several accounts, they struggled at first to recognize the man in front of them. His body had changed dramatically after years of health struggles, and the effects of his final hours had altered his appearance further. He was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital, where doctors worked to revive him, but it was too late. Elvis Presley was pronounced dead that afternoon, and within minutes the news had reached radio stations, television broadcasts, and newspaper desks across the country. Before the public would get its chance to say goodbye, Elvis's body went through a process almost no one outside a small circle of professionals ever witnessed. An autopsy was performed at the hospital, at his father Vernon's request, to try to understand exactly what had happened. Afterward, his body was transported to the Memphis Funeral Home, where the senior embalmer on staff took over. This was a man who had handled many difficult cases over a long career, people who had died from illness, from accidents, from the ordinary and extraordinary ends that come to everyone eventually. But those who later described that night said even he was struck by what he saw. Years of illness had visibly changed Elvis. Reports from people connected to the case described significant swelling, discoloration consistent with the hours that had passed before he was found, and hair that had gone gray with age but was dyed jet black for public appearances, a detail that surprised even some people close to him, since so few had ever seen the king without his signature color. The embalmer's job that night was not simple. In a matter of hours, he had to prepare a man's body for what would become one of the largest public viewings in American history, knowing that tens of thousands of grieving fans would soon file past the casket. Heavy cosmetic work went into restoring a more familiar, peaceful appearance, softening the swelling and discoloration through careful technique, redoing the hair color, dressing him in a white suit and pale blue shirt, and placing on his finger the TCB ring that had become one of his personal trademarks, standing for taking care of business. When the doors of Graceland opened the next day, more than 30,000 people reportedly passed through in a line that stretched for hours in the August heat, many of them having driven through the night just to spend a few seconds beside the casket. It's what happened after the embalming was finished, though, that eventually became its own strange footnote to the Elvis story. Instead of disposing of the tools and materials used that night, as would normally happen, the embalmer set several items aside. According to later accounts, this included rubber gloves, forceps, lip brushes used for cosmetic work, an arterial tube, aneurysm hooks, a comb, paperwork from the case, and a replacement identification tag reading John Doe, reportedly used because the original hospital tag had gone missing, allegedly taken by someone who managed to get close to the body before it reached the funeral home. He placed these items together and kept them. For more than 3 decades, he said nothing publicly about why. That silence ended, unexpectedly, in 2010. A Chicago auction house called Leslie Hindman Auctioneers announced it would be selling the collection on behalf of the former senior embalmer, who wished to remain anonymous. The listing included the gloves, the forceps, the lip brushes, the arterial tube, the aneurysm hooks, the John Doe tag, a case report from the preparation room, dry cleaning tags, the hanger from Elvis's burial suit, and the invoice for shipping the casket. Estimates suggested the lots could bring in as much as $8,000 to $14,000 combined. News of the sale spread quickly, covered by outlets including the BBC, Reuters, and the Chicago Tribune, and it reignited public fascination with the final hours of Elvis's life, but it also drew sharp criticism. The funeral home objected, arguing the items rightfully belonged to them rather than to the individual embalmer, and the parent company that owned the funeral home released a statement calling the planned sale entirely inappropriate, saying it was inconsistent with their commitment to treat every family's loved one, celebrity or not, with privacy, dignity, and respect. Professionals in the funeral industry weighed in too, with at least one mortuary science educator publicly questioning both the ethics and the authenticity of the collection, noting that people place enormous trust in embalmers and that professionals are generally not supposed to profit personally from their work on a case. Under that pressure, the auction was withdrawn before the sale date arrived, and the items were returned. Before disappearing from public view again, the embalmer reportedly made one brief comment to those following the story, that people deserved to know the truth about what happened that night inside the preparation room. He did not elaborate. He gave no further interviews, published no memoir, and never explained exactly what truth he meant. Was he referring to the physical toll illness had taken on Elvis's body, something the public rarely saw behind the polished image of the king on stage? Was he speaking about the emotional weight of preparing someone so famous for their final appearance, knowing millions of people had built a piece of their own lives around this man's music? Or was there something more specific he felt had never been said? No clear answer ever came, and that unfinished sentence is, in many ways, the whole reason this story still gets told today. What we do know, from records and reporting that are far better documented than the embalmer's brief comment, paints a fuller picture of what Elvis's body and his medical history revealed. The Shelby County medical examiner at the time, Dr. Jerry Francisco, initially told the public that Elvis had died of cardiac arrhythmia connected to underlying heart disease, and said there was no evidence that drugs played a role. That was the story most Americans heard first. But weeks later, toxicology results told a more complicated version of events. Laboratory testing reportedly identified more than a dozen different prescription medications in Elvis's system, including drugs prescribed for pain, anxiety, and other conditions, with codeine levels described as significantly higher than what would typically be expected for standard medical treatment. That gap between the first public explanation and the later toxicology findings fueled decades of debate among doctors, journalists, and fans about how much those medications may have contributed to his death. Attention also turned to Elvis's longtime personal physician, Dr. George Nichopoulos, widely known as Dr. Nick. Records examined during the following investigation showed he had written an extraordinary number of prescriptions for Elvis in his final months, covering painkillers, sedatives, and stimulants in quantities that raised serious concern among investigators. He was criminally charged over his prescribing practices but was acquitted by a jury. Years later, however, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners conducted its own separate review and ultimately revoked his medical license, concluding that his treatment of several patients, including Elvis, amounted to serious ethical and professional violations. Adding another layer to the mystery, Vernon Presley made the decision to have the complete autopsy report and toxicology records sealed from public access for 50 years, a decision upheld by the Tennessee Supreme Court in 1982. Whether that was done purely to protect his son's privacy or to shield the family from further scrutiny has never been definitively settled, and the sealed records have kept researchers working from partial information ever since. The public farewell itself became one of the most extraordinary funeral events in American history. Vernon Presley made the difficult call to allow an open casket viewing at Graceland, believing fans deserved a final chance to see the man whose music had shaped their lives. The casket was placed beneath a chandelier in the mansion's front hall, and for hours the line of mourners never seemed to end. Photography was strictly forbidden out of respect for the family's wishes, but at least one tabloid reportedly managed to sneak a small camera inside after the public viewing had ended, resulting in a photograph that later became one of the best-selling tabloid covers in American publishing history, a moment that deeply upset the Presley family and added to the sense that even in death, Elvis's privacy could not be fully protected. Among the countless mourners that day was Elvis's 9-year-old daughter, Lisa Marie, who reportedly asked to place a small bracelet on her father's wrist before the casket was closed, a quiet, private gesture inside an otherwise overwhelming public event. The day after the viewing, tens of thousands of people lined the streets of Memphis to watch the funeral procession pass by. Elvis was initially placed in a private mausoleum at Forest Hill Cemetery, alongside his mother Gladys, whom he had been extremely close to and never fully recovered from losing years earlier. According to former Graceland staff member Nancy Rooks, who wrote about her years working for the family, Elvis had mentioned more than once during his life that he would have preferred an above-ground resting place rather than a traditional burial, a wish some believed was tied to the way his mother had originally been laid to rest. That preference was never written into a formal will, so it remains something the family and those closest to Elvis had to interpret rather than follow to the letter. Only weeks after the funeral, reports emerged of an alleged plot to break into the mausoleum, remove Elvis's body, and demand a ransom for its return. Several men were arrested in connection with the incident. Whatever the full truth of that plan was, the Presley family took no chances. Vernon arranged to have Elvis's remains, along with those of his mother, quietly moved to the meditation garden on the Graceland property itself, where security could be far better controlled. He had originally hoped to build a grand above-ground mausoleum there in keeping with what Elvis had reportedly wanted, but the estate was already facing serious financial strain from debts, taxes, and the enormous cost of simply maintaining Graceland, and those plans were eventually abandoned. In the end, Elvis was buried in the ground in the meditation garden, a decision Vernon reportedly made with real reluctance, prioritizing his son's safety over his stated preference. Over the following decades, that same garden became a family resting place. Vernon himself was later buried there, along with his mother Minnie May, a memorial for Elvis's twin brother Jesse Guerin, who died at birth, and, much more recently, Elvis's grandson Benjamin Keogh and his daughter Lisa Marie Presley. A headline might promise. What we actually have is a documented record of a man whose public image and private health had drifted far apart by the end of his life, a medical investigation that evolved and became more complicated as new evidence emerged, a family that chose secrecy over full disclosure and has faced questions about that decision ever since, and one embalmer who, for reasons he only ever hinted at, held on to physical proof of a night most people in his profession would rather forget. He never gave the interview that would have explained everything. He never wrote the book. What he left behind instead was a box of ordinary tools that somehow became extraordinary simply because of the moment they were used, and a single sentence suggesting there was more to know. Almost 50 years later, with parts of the official record still restricted from public view, it's fair to say the full picture of Elvis Presley's final hours has never been completely revealed, and maybe that unfinished quality is exactly why the story continues to pull people in. It's worth stepping back and asking why a story about embalming tools resonates with people at all, decades after the fact. Part of it is simply the gap between the Elvis the world watched on stage and the Elvis those closest to him actually saw in his final years. For most fans, the image frozen in memory was the performer in a rhinestone jumpsuit, full of energy, dominating a room the moment he walked into it. The reality behind closed doors, according to people who were there, looked very different. A man in his 40s dealing with serious, ongoing health problems, isolated in some ways by his own fame, surrounded by people who wanted to help him but weren't always equipped to do so. That contrast between the public legend and the private struggle is part of what makes stories like the Embalmer's collection feel so significant, even when the physical objects themselves are, on their face, just ordinary tools of a difficult profession. There's also the matter of trust, which came up repeatedly when the auction controversy unfolded in 2010. Funeral professionals are given access to some of the most private, vulnerable moments a family will ever go through, and the expectation in that industry has always been that whatever happens in the preparation room stays there, out of respect for the person who died and the people who love them. When items connected to that process end up for public sale, even decades later, it raises uncomfortable questions about where the line sits between preserving history and profiting from someone else's grief. That's precisely why the funeral home pushed back so hard, and why the sale was ultimately pulled before a single item changed hands. In a strange way, the controversy itself became part of the historical record, a reminder of just how much interest still surrounds anything connected to Elvis's final hours, even a set of rubber gloves and a length of arterial tubing. The sealed medical records add another layer that keeps this story alive rather than letting it settle. 50 years is a long time to keep a public figure's most detailed medical information out of view, and the fact that Vernon Presley pursued that protection all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court tells you how seriously the family took the matter. Depending on how you look at it, that decision was either a reasonable act of protecting a grieving family's privacy during an intensely public tragedy, or it was a move that, intentionally or not, left space for decades of speculation to fill in the blanks that official records might otherwise have settled. Either way, researchers and journalists have had to work with partial information for nearly 50 years now, relying on public statements, court testimony from the Dr. Nick case, and second-hand accounts from people who were present, rather than the complete medical file itself. What do you think really happened behind those doors, and do you think the sealed records should ever be made public? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this look into one of music history's most enduring mysteries, like this video, subscribe for more, and we'll see you in the next one. ILO.